Chapter 14. The next morning Mickey set out again for the trap-line of Jacques Le Beau. It was not the thought of food easily secured that tempted him. There would have been a great thrill in killing for himself. It was the trail, with its smell of the man-beast, that drew him like a magnet. Where that smell was very strong he wanted to lie down and wait. Yet with his desire there was also fear, and a steadily growing caution. He did not tamper with the first kekek, nor with the second. At the third, Le Beau had fumbled in the placing of his bait, and for that reason the little ball of fat was strong with the scent of his hands. A fox would have turned away from it quickly. Mickey, however, drew it from the peg and dropped it in the snow between his forefeet. Then he looked about him, and listened for a full minute. After that he licked the ball of fat with his tongue. The scent of Le Beau's hands kept him from swallowing it, as he had swallowed the caribou meat. A little suspiciously he crushed it slowly between his jaws. The fat was sweet. He was about to gulp it down when he detected another and less pleasant taste, and what remained in his mouth he spat out upon the snow. But the acrid bite of the poison remained upon his tongue and in his throat. It crept deeper, and he caught up a mouthful of snow and swallowed it to put out the burning sensation that was crawling nearer to his vitals. Had he devoured the ball of fat as he had eaten the other baits, he would have been dead within a quarter of an hour, and Le Beau would not have gone far to find his body. As it was, he was beginning to turn sick at the end of 15 minutes. A premonition of the evil that was upon him drew him off the trail and in the direction of the windfall. He had gone only a short distance when suddenly his legs gave way under him and he fell. He began to shiver. Every muscle in his body trembled. His teeth clicked. His eyes grew wide, and it was impossible for him to move. And then, like a hand throttling him, there came a strange stiffness in the back of his neck, and his breath hissed chokingly out of his throat. The stiffness passed like a wave of fire through his body. Where his muscles had trembled and shivered a moment before, they now became rigid and lifeless. The throttling grip of the poison at the base of his brain drew his head back until his muzzle was pointed straight up to the sky. Still he made no cry. For a space every nerve in his body was at the point of death. Then came the change. As though a string had snapped, the horrible grip left the back of his neck, the stiffness shot out of his body in a flood of shivering cold, and in another moment he was twisting and tearing up the snow in mad convulsions. The spasm lasted for perhaps a minute. When it was over, Mickey was panting. Streams of saliva dripped from his jaws into the snow. But he was alive. Death had missed him by a hair, and after a little he staggered to his feet and continued on his way to the windfall. Thereafter Jacques Le Beau might place 1,000,000 poison capsules in his way, and he would not touch them. Never again would he steal the meat from a bait peg. 2 days later Le Beau saw where Mickey had fought his fight with death in the snow, and his heart was black with rage and disappointment. He began to follow the footprints of the dog. It was noon when he came to the windfall, and saw the beaten path where Mickey entered it. On his knees he peered into the cavernous depths, and saw nothing. But Mickey, lying watchfully, saw the man, and he was like the black, bearded monster who had almost killed him with a club a long time ago. And in his heart, too, there was disappointment. For away back in his memory of things there was always the thought of Challoner, the master he had lost, and it was never Challoner whom he found when he came upon the man-smell. Le Beau heard his growl, and the man's blood leaped excitedly as he rose to his feet. He could not go in after the wild dog, but he could not lure him out. But there was another way. He would drive him out with fire. Deep back in his fortress, Mickey heard the crunch of Le Beau's feet in the snow. A few minutes later he saw the man-beast again peering into his lair. "Bet! Bet!" he called half-tauntingly, and again Mickey growled. Jacques was satisfied. The windfall was not more than 30 or 40 feet in diameter, and about it the forest was open and clear of undergrowth. It would be impossible for the wild dog to get away from his rifle. A second time he went around the piled-up mass of fallen timber. On 3 sides it was completely smothered under the deep snow. Only where Micky's trail entered was it open. Getting the wind behind him, Le Beau made his igloo of birch bark and dry wood at the far end of the windfall. The seasoned logs and tree-tops caught the fire like tinder, and within a few minutes the flames began to crackle and roar in a manner that made Mickey wonder what was happening. For a space the smoke did not reach him. Le Beau, watching, with his rifle in his bare hands, did not for an instant let his eyes leave the spot where the wild dog must come out. Suddenly a pungent whiff of smoke filled Micky's nostrils, and a thin white cloud crept in a ghostly veil between him and the opening. A crawling, snake-like rope of it began to pour between 2 logs within a yard of him, and with it the strange roaring grew nearer and more menacing. Then, for the first time, he saw lightning flashes of yellow flame through the tangled débris as the fire ate into the heart of a mass of pitch-filled spruce. In another 10 seconds the flames leaped 20 feet into the air, and Jacques Le Beau stood with his rifle half to his shoulder, ready to kill. Appalled by the danger that was upon him, Mickey did not forget Le Beau. With an instinct sharpened to fox-like keenness, his mind leaped instantly to the truth of the matter. It was the man-beast who had set his new enemy upon him. And out there, just beyond the opening, the man-beast was waiting. So, like the fox, he did what Le Beau least expected. He crawled back swiftly through the tangled tops until he came to the wall of snow that shut the windfall in, and through this he burrowed his way almost as quickly as the fox himself would have done it. With his jaws he tore through the half-inch outer crust, and a moment later stood in the open with the fire between him and Le Beau. The windfall was a blazing furnace, and suddenly Le Beau ran back a dozen steps so that he could see on the farther side. 100 yards away he saw Mickey making for the deeper forest. It was a clear shot. At that distance Le Beau would have staked his life that it was impossible for him to miss. He did not hurry. 1 shot and it would be over. He raised his rifle, and in that instant a wisp of smoke came like the lash of a whip with the wind and caught him fairly in the eyes, and his bullet passed 3 inches over Micky's head. The whining snarl of it was a new thing to Mickey. But he recognized the thunder of the gun, and he knew what a gun could do. To Le Beau, still firing at him through the merciful cloud of smoke, he was like a gray streak flashing to the thick timber. 3 times more Le Beau fired. From the edge of a dense clump of spruce, Mickey flung back a defiant howl. He disappeared as Le Beau's last shot shoveled up the snow at his heels. The narrowness of his escape from the man-beast did not frighten Mickey out of the Jackson's Knee country. If anything, it held him more closely to it. It gave him something to think about besides Neewa and his aloneness. As the fox returns to peer stealthily upon the deadfall that has almost caught him, So the trapline was possessed now of a new thrill for Miki. Heretofore the man smell had held for him only a vague significance. Now it marked the presence of a real and concrete danger. And he welcomed it. His wits were sharpened. The fascination of the trapline was deadlier than before. From the burned windfall he made a wide detour to a point where Le Beau's snowshoe trail entered the edge of the swamp, and here, hidden in a thick clump of bushes, he watched him as he traveled homeward half an hour later. From that day he hung like a grim, gray ghost on the trapline. Silent-footed, cautious, always on the alert for the danger which threatened him, he haunted Jacques Le Beau's thoughts and footsteps with the elusive persistence of a werewolf, a loup-garou of the Black Forest. Twice in the next week Le Beau caught a flash of him. 3 times he heard him howl. And twice he followed his trail, until, in despair and exhaustion, he turned back. Never was Miki caught unaware. He ate no more baits in the trap houses. Even when Le Beau lured him with the whole carcass of a rabbit, he would not touch it, nor would he touch a rabbit frozen dead in a snare. From Le Beau's traps he took only the living things, chiefly birds and squirrels, and the big web-footed snowshoe rabbits. And because a mink jumped at him once and tore open his nose, he destroyed a number of minks so utterly that their pelts were spoiled. He found himself another windfall, but instinct taught him now never to go to it directly, but to approach it and leave it in a roundabout way. Day and night Le Beau, the man-brute, plotted against him. He set many poison baits. He killed a doe and scattered strychnine in its entrails. He built deadfalls, and baited them with meat soaked in boiling fat. He made himself a blind of spruce and cedar boughs, and sat for long hours, watching with his rifle. And still Miki was the victor. One day Miki found a huge fisher cat in one of the traps. He had not forgotten the battle of long ago with Oochak, the other fisher cat, or the whipping he had received. But there was no thought of vengeance in his heart on the early evening he became acquainted with Oochak the Second. Usually he was in his windfall at dusk, but this afternoon a great and devouring loneliness had held him on the trail. The spirit of Kuskayitum, the hand of the mating god, was pressing heavily upon him. The consuming desire of flesh and blood for the companionship of other flesh and blood. It burned in his veins like a fever. It took away from him all thought of hunger or of the hunt. In his soul was a vast unfilled yearning. It was then that he came upon Oochak. Perhaps it was the same Oochak of months ago. If so, he had grown even as Miki had grown. He was splendid, with his long silken fur and his sleek body, and he was not struggling, but sat awaiting his fate without excitement. To Miki he looked warm and soft and comfortable. It made him think of Neewa and the 101 nights they had slept together. His desire leaped out to Oochak. He whined softly as he advanced. He would make friends. Even with Oochak, his old enemy, he would lie down in peace and happiness, so great was the gnawing emptiness in his heart. Oochak made no response, nor did he move, but sat furred up like a huge, soft ball, watching Miki as he crept nearer on his belly. Something of the old puppishness came back into the dog. He wriggled and thumped his tail, and as he whined again he seemed to say, "Let's forget the old trouble, Oochak. Let's be friends. I've got a fine windfall, and I'll kill you a rabbit." And still Oochak did not move or make a sound. At last Miki could almost reach out with his forepaws and touch him. He dragged himself still nearer, and his tail thumped harder. "And I'll get you out of the trap," he may have been saying. "It's the man-beast trap, and I hate him." And then, so suddenly that Miki had no chance to guard himself, Oochak sprang the length of the trap chain and was at him. With teeth and razor-edged claws he tore deep gashes in Miki's nose. Even then the blood of battle rose slowly in him, and he might have retreated had not Oochak's teeth got a hold in his shoulder. With a roar he tried to shake himself free, but Oochak held on. Then his jaws snapped at the back of the fisher cat's neck. When he was done, Oochak was dead. He slunk away, but in him there was no more the thrill of the victor. He had killed, but in killing he had found no joy. Upon him, the four-footed beast, had fallen at last the oppression of the thing that drives men mad. He stood in the heart of a vast world, and for him that world was empty. He was an outcast. His heart crying out for comradeship, he found that all things feared him or hated him. He was a pariah, a wanderer without a friend or a home. He did not reason these things, but the gloom of them settled upon him like black night. He did not return to his windfall. In a little open he sat on his haunches, listening to the night sounds and watching the stars as they came out. There was an early moon, and as it came up over the forest, a great throbbing red disk that seemed filled with life, he howled mournfully in the face of it. He wandered out into a big burn a little later, and there the night was like day, so clear that his shadow followed him and all other things about him cast shadows. And then, all at once, he caught in the night wind a sound which he had heard many times before. It came from far away, and it was like a whisper at first, an echo of strange voices riding on the wind. 100 times he had heard that cry of the wolves. Since Mahigun, the she-wolf, had gashed his shoulder so fiercely away back in the days of his puppyhood, he had evaded the path of that cry. He had learned, in a way, to hate it. But he could not wipe out entirely the thrill that came with that call of the blood. And tonight it rode over all his fear and hatred. Out there was company. Whence the cry came, the wild brethren were running 2 by 2 and 3 by 3, and there was comradeship. His body quivered. An answering cry rose in his throat, dying away in a whine, and for an hour after that he heard no more of the wolf cry in the wind. The pack had swung to the west, so far away that their voices were lost. And it passed, with the moon straight over them, close to the shack of Pierrot, the half-breed. In Pierrot's cabin was a white man, on his way to Fort o' God. He saw that Pierrot crossed himself and muttered. "It is the mad pack," explained Pierrot then. "Monsieur, they have been Kisquau since the beginning of the new moon. In them are the spirits of devils." He opened the cabin door a little, so that the mad cry of the beasts came to them plainly. When he closed it there was in his eyes a look of strange fear. "Now and then the wolves go like that, Kisquau, stark mad, in the dead of winter," he shuddered. "3 days ago there were 20 of them, monsieur, for I saw them with my own eyes, and counted their tracks in the snow. Since then they have been murdered and torn into strings by the others of the pack. Listen to them ravin'. Can you tell me why, monsieur? Can you tell me why wolves sometimes go mad in the heart of winter, when there is no heat or rotten meat to turn them sick? No? But I can tell you. They are the loup garous. In their bodies ride the spirits of devils, and there they will ride until the bodies die. For the wolves that go mad in the deep snows always die, monsieur. That is the strange part of it. They die." And then it was, swinging eastward from the cabin of Pierrot, that the mad wolves of Jackson's Knee came into the country of the big swamp wherein trees bore the double X blaze of Jacques Le Beau's axe. There were 14 of them running in the moonlight. What it is that now and then drives a wolf pack mad in the dead of winter, no man yet has wholly learned. Possibly it begins with a bad wolf, just as a bad sledge dog, nipping and biting his fellows, will spread his distemper among them until the team becomes an ugly, quarrelsome horde. Such a dog the wise driver kills or turns loose. The wolves that bore down upon Le Beau's country were red-eyed and thin. Their bodies were covered with gashes, and the mouths of some frothed blood. They did not run as wolves run for meat. They were a sinister and suspicious lot, with a sneaking droop to their haunches, and their cry was not the deep-throated cry of the hunt pack, but a ravening clamour that seemed to have no leadership or cause. Scarcely was the sound of their tongues gone beyond the hearing of Pierrot's ears than one of the thin grey beasts rubbed against the shoulder of another, and the second turned with the swiftness of a snake, like the bad dog of the traces, and struck his fangs deep into the first wolf's flesh. Could Pierrot have seen, he would have understood then how the 4 he had found had come to their end. Swift as the snap of a whiplash, the fight between the 2 was on. The other 12 of the pack stopped. They came back, circling in cautiously and grimly silent about their fighting comrades. They ranged themselves in a ring, as men gather about a fistic battle, and there they waited, their jaws drooling, their fangs clicking, a low and eager whining smothered in their throats. And then the thing happened. One of the fighting wolves went down. He was on his back, and the end came. The 12 wolves were upon him as one, and, like those Pierrot had seen, he was torn to pieces, and his flesh devoured. After that the 13 went on deeper into Le Beau's country. Miki heard them again, after that hour's interval of silence. Farther and farther he had wandered from the forest. He had crossed the burn, and was in the open plain, with the rough ridges cutting through, and the big river at the edge of it. It was not so gloomy out here, and his loneliness weighed upon him less heavily than in the deep timber. And across this plain came the voice of the wolves. He did not move away from it tonight. He waited, silhouetted against the vivid starlight at the crest of a rocky knoll, and the top of this knoll was so small that another could not have stood beside him without their shoulders touching. On all sides of him the plain swept away in the white light of the stars and moon. Never had the desire to respond to the wild brethren urged itself upon him more fiercely than now. He flung back his head until his black-tipped muzzle pointed up to the stars, and the voice rolled out of his throat. But it was only half a howl. Even then, oppressed by his great loneliness, there gripped him that something instinctive which warned him against betrayal. After that he remained quiet, and as the wolves drew nearer his body grew tense, his muscles hardened, and in his throat there was the low whispering of a snarl instead of a howl. He sensed danger. He had caught, in the voice of the wolves, the ravening note that had made Pierrot cross himself and mutter of the loup garou, and he crouched down on his belly at the top of the rocky mound. Then he saw them. They were sweeping like dark and swiftly moving shadows between him and the forest. Suddenly they stopped, and for a few moments no sound came from them as they packed themselves closely on the scent of his fresh trail in the snow. And then they surged in his direction. This time there was still fiercer madness in the wild cry that rose from their throats. In a dozen seconds they were at the mound. They swept around it and past it, all save one, a huge gray brute who shot up the hillock straight at the prey the others had not yet seen. There was a snarl in Micky's throat as he came. Once more he was facing the thrill of a great fight. Once more the blood ran suddenly hot in his veins, and fear was driven from him, as the wind drives smoke from a fire. If Neewa were only there now, to fend at his back while he fought in front. He stood up on his feet. He met the uprushing pack brute head to head. Their jaws clashed, and the wild wolf found jaws at last that crunched through his own as if they had been a whelp's bone. And he rolled and twisted back to the plain in a dying agony. But not until another gray form had come to fill his place. Into the throat of this second Micky drove his fangs as the wolf came over the crest. It was the slashing, saber-like stroke of the North dog, and the throat of the wolf was torn open and the blood poured out as if emptied by the blade of a knife. Down he plunged to join the first, and in that instant the pack swept up and over Micky, and he was smothered under the mass of their bodies. Had 2 or 3 attacked him at once, he would have died as quickly as the first 2 of his enemies had come to their end. Numbers had saved him in the first rush. On the level of the plain he would have been torn into pieces like a bit of cloth, but on the space at the top of the kopje, no larger than the top of a table, he was lost for a few seconds under the snarling and rending horde of his enemies. Fangs intended for him sank into the other wolf flesh. The madness of the pack became a blind rage, and the assault upon Micky turned into a slaughter of the wolves themselves. On his back, held down by the weight of bodies, Micky drove his fangs again and again into flesh. A pair of jaws seized him in the groin, and a shock of agony swept through him. It was a death grip, sinking steadily into his vitals. Just in time another pair of jaws seized the wolf who held him, and the hold in his groin gave way. In that moment Micky felt himself plunging down the steep side of the knoll, and after him came a half of what was left alive of the pack. The fighting devils in Micky's brain gave way all at once to that cunning of the fox which had served him even more than claw and fang in times of great danger. Scarcely had he reached the plain before he was on his feet, and no sooner had he touched his feet than he was off like the wind in direction of the river. He had gained a 50-yard start before the first of the wolves discovered his flight. There were only 8 that followed him now. Of the 13 mad beasts, 5 were dead or dying at the foot of the hillock. Of these Micky had slain 2. The others had fallen at the fangs of their own brethren. Half a mile away were the steep cliffs of the river, and at the edge of these cliffs was a great cairn of rocks in which for one night Micky had sought shelter. He had not forgotten the tunnel into the tumbled mass of rock debris, nor how easily it could be defended from within. Once in that tunnel, he would turn in the door of it and slaughter his enemies one by one, for only one by one could they attack him. But he had not reckoned with that huge gray form behind him that might have been named Lightning, the fiercest and swiftest of all the mad wolves of the pack. He sped ahead of his slower-footed companions like a streak of light, and Miki had made but half the distance to the cairn when he heard the panting breath of Lightning behind him. Even Hela, his father, could not have run more swiftly than Miki, but, great as Miki's speed, Lightning ran more swiftly. 2/3 of the distance to the cliff, and the huge wolf's muzzle was at Miki's flank. With a burst of speed Miki gained a little. Then steadily Lightning drew abreast of him, a grim and merciless shadow of doom. 100 yards farther on, and a little to the right, was the cairn. But Miki could not run to the right without turning into Lightning's jaws, and he realized now that if he reached the cairn his enemy would be upon him before he could dive into the tunnel and face about. To stop and fight would be death, for behind he could hear the other wolves. 10 seconds more, and the chasm of the river yawned ahead of them. At its very brink Miki swung and struck at Lightning. He sensed death now, and in the face of death all his hatred turned upon the one beast that had run at his side. In an instant they were down. 2 yards from the edge of the cliff, and Miki's jaws were at Lightning's throat when the pack rushed upon them. They were swept onward. The earth flew out from under their feet, and they were in space. Grimly Miki held to the throat of his foe. Over and over they twisted in mid-air, and then came a terrific shock. Lightning was under. Yet so great was the shock that, even though the wolf's huge body was under him like a cushion, Miki was stunned and dazed. A minute passed before he staggered to his feet. Lightning lay still, the life smashed out of him. A little beyond him lay the bodies of 2 other wolves that in their wild rush had swept over the cliff. Miki looked up. Between him and the stars he could see the top of the cliff, a vast distance above him. One after the other he smelled at the bodies of the 3 dead wolves. Then he limped slowly along the base of the cliff until he came to a fissure between 2 huge rocks. Into this he crept and lay down, licking his wounds. After all, there were worse things in the world than Le Beau's trap line. Perhaps there were even worse things than men. After a time he stretched his great head out between his forepaws, and slowly the starlight grew dimmer, and the snow less white, and he slept. End of chapter 14.